Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a monthly podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues. Produced as a collaboration between the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa Research and Media Services. My name's Adam. It's good to be with you. I'm joined once again by Dr. Solomon Durso, Executive Director of Amani Africa. Solomon, how are you? You've been on a work trip overseas to Berlin. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing over there.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Good to be with you once again for our podcast series on Conversing on Africa's Peace. Yes, I was in Berlin last week for the Berlin Africa Forum, convened by the European Council on Foreign Relations in collaboration with IPSS, the Institute for Peace and Security Studies of Addis Ababa University, where TANA Forum is hosted. The purpose of this gathering is to reflect on the relationship between Europe and Africa in the context of the changing global dynamics against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and its implications, but also what it actually suggests about the state of global relations at the moment. So it is basically about reflecting on how the international system has changed and is changing, and what this actually means for Africa-Europe relationship.
You joined a panel? You spoke on a panel?
Yes, I actually chaired a panel on the role of values in this context since the end of the Cold War. Obviously, the end of the Cold War is a significant milestone in international relations, which in some ways suggests a reference to what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. Right. But we are actually in the end of history.
It feels like history's still happening.
Basically, we are.
And it wasn't that long ago, Solomon, you wrote an article musing on the possibilities of a new Cold War in Africa, which I'm sure was very much in people's minds during the forum.
Yeah, but I think interestingly enough, one of the things that I found to be instructive about this engagement is not only the recognition of the changing global dynamics and the fundamental changes that are happening, including the fragmentation of the international system and the growing tension among various power centers in the world, the lack of trust, and how this actually fits into the quest for a reform, or if you like, a remaking of the global order. Yeah. So questions have been asking on whether or not indeed there has been a global order, or it was actually, an order that is an extension of the power of powerful countries, particularly the West. Those were among the questions that have been asked in the context of Europe-Africa relationship. I think it's interesting to see the connection between the issues that have been raised and discussed and the way they were discussed, and the changing tone in the General Assembly. Yes. Including, for example, from the Secretary General of the UN, who actually came out and said openly that the international system is broken, it is unequal, it is unfair for most developing countries, that it needs to be fixed.
Seismic shift, really, in a lot of ways, forwards.
And a remaking of international order that adequately takes into account how the current system unfairly treats countries in the South, including African countries. Yeah. And, addressing actually, including shifts, for example, from development aid to one of actually development financing, and also changing, the focus towards allowing the change of structure including, for example, with respect to the vaccine, the experience that we have seen, and issues relating to the TRIPS waiver.
So not new ideas necessarily, they're common in African circles for a long time, really, but the prominence and the amplification and the centrality of them in, as you say, pivotal discussions in the UN and other places, a really interesting development, right?
Yes, absolutely. But, centering on power relations and how the current power structure of the international system is skewed and even possibly rigged against developing countries, most of which from the African continent.
Well, we probably should have or could have had a special edition on these topics, Solomon, but we're here to focus. And look, thank you for sharing those reflections. I was following it all on social media, but great just to hear from somebody who took part and to get some reflections from you. So very grateful for that. But let's move on to the business at hand, which is, again, consideration of the Peace and Security Council. Very briefly, last month, a big month for the Peace and Security Council. They all are, it seems. Before we dive into October, can you offer reflections or some insights on two agenda items from September in particular? Firstly, I'm interested in the AU Peace Fund agenda item and these ongoing discussions around how member states contribute, what will it be used for, under what circumstances. Are we likely to see some new developments in this space in light of the most recent meeting, or do those bottlenecks, are they still there?
Yes, absolutely. So as far as the Peace Fund, the utilization of the Peace Fund is concerned, there was progress made in the course of 2021 and 2022 based on the proposal about, the pilot use of the fund, particularly not the actual fund, but the interest on the fund.
Yes.
So a portion of the interest on the fund, particularly with respect to the crisis reserve fund,
yes,
which is an aspect of the peace fund, as established under Article 21 of the PSC protocol, but also in terms of the potential use of certain a portion of the fund from the interest. Currently, the contribution of member states stands at about 280 million.
Yep.
From the 400 million that the peace for the revitalized peace fund is expected to have. Yep. So there is a proposal on the table, which provides for 8.4 million of the about 16 million US dollars from the interest, and the additional 5 million of the crisis reserve fund, which is going to be tabled for the Assembly of Heads of State and Government based on the meeting that was held in Lusaka, Zambia. So this meeting that was held on the 16th of September is meant to harmonize the positions and understanding of member states, including in terms of ensuring compliance with the financial rules and regulations of the African Union.
So that sounds like progress. And then at the summit in February, next steps.
Exactly. Particularly on the 8.4 million and the 5 million funds that are meant to be used for giving the AU flexibility to respond to emerging issues on the one hand, and then the use of the crisis reserve fund as well. So those, there are one point, for example, that still needs to be fixed.
Sure.
This has to do with the modality or the mechanism for replenishing the crisis reserve fund. That one is yet to be agreed.
Okay. But still, let's call that a win and call it progress, which is really good, because I know it's been...
While it sounds slow, I think, it is indeed a progress.
Yeah.
But it's better to get it right in terms of the processes.
Yeah.
When you start it, rather than rushing into starting using it and then getting the process wrong and then running into difficulty.
Fair point. Well made. Secondly, looking back, the ministerial level session held in the margins of the UN General Assembly focused on the issue of terrorism on the continent. I'm interested to hear what you make of that meeting and its outcomes. Do these New York meetings kind of take on added significance or importance because of when and where they take place? Or do they just happen there because that's where all the ministers are in September? Interested in that. And what were some of the key outcomes of that meeting, noting some really topical stuff going on in the anti-terrorism space at the moment?
So the ministerial meeting on the sidelines of the 77th UN General Assembly is not uncommon. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it happens at the level of ministers. Sometimes it happens even at the level of heads of state. So the PSC actually uses the opportunity of member states at the highest levels gathering in New York for convening such kind of high-level events, either at the ministerial and at heads of state level. So it's not uncommon, actually. The idea is really to take advantage of the presence of high-level members of the PSC to draw attention on what the chair of the MINS considers to be an important topic that deserves attention at that level. And in the current context, understandably, obviously, as you know, Ghana from West Africa is a country that is a great deal of, with a great deal of concern, the events that are unfolding in the Sahel, particularly in terms of the expansion of the threat of terrorism, geographically speaking, now trying to get a foothold, penetrate into the literal countries of West Africa on the coast, including Ghana. So there is therefore very, direct interest on the part of Ghana to convene this high-level meeting as a follow-up to the Malabo summit, which also paid attention to the issue of terrorism. And understandably, the one of the major, if not, the most serious peace and security issue at the moment on the continent, it is the growing incident of attacks of terrorist attacks on the continent, but also their geographic spread. So it is focusing particularly that particular high-level PSC meeting focused on how to strengthen the role of regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, such as the Economic Community of Central African States, in order to enhance the role that various actors in the peace and security arena on the continent play.
And there was the extraordinary ECOWAS gathering recently, correct me if I'm wrong as well, which, a week or two later, there we were with a second coup in Burkina Faso, and then the range of reactions, both in terms of the regional response, but also national continental response. Again, root causes stemming out of the instability caused by terrorism. Any reflections on that before we move on?
So, understandably, one of the areas of focus, apart from identifying ways and means of bolstering the role of regional economic communities and mechanisms in countering terrorism and violent extremism, it was also how to shift the skewed attention that prioritizes military oriented responses to terrorism, as opposed to those that also give priority or give full attention to the socioeconomic and political governance pathologies, as we call them in Amani Africa special report that we prepared ahead of the Malabo summit on terrorism. So there is that aspect of the work as well. As you rightly said, attending to that is equally, if not more important, than basically throwing weapons at terrorism, because no amount of force would be adequate in order to address the scourge of terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, you've made that point before, and it remains, front and center in my thinking, and it's true today as it was. I think we might have even talked about this briefly last month. So suddenly, somehow, October is here. The sun is trying to shine in Addis Ababa. It feels like the rainy season's sort of slowly coming to an end. But what also it feels like to me is that the city is really buzzing now with kind of diplomatic energy. There's so much going on in so many different contexts at the African Union and elsewhere. That kind of atmosphere and that range of issues being discussed and debated is obviously part of what makes living and working here so interesting. And with that said, the Kingdom of Morocco is in the Peace and Security Council chair for October. I've cast my eyes over your provisional analysis document for the month, which is available online. And I note we're likely to see 5 substantive sessions with 2, once more at ministerial level. Some really important thematic issues to be covered, including the protection of women and girls from sexual violence in conflict, stopping the ongoing issue of the recruitment of child soldiers, development and de-radicalization as levers to counter terrorism and violent extremism, food security, and obviously very topically climate change, peace and security, which is increasingly under the microscope, I guess, in the lead up to COP27 in Egypt. There'll also be a session on the Sahel, and we've touched a little bit on some of the issues there already. And of course, following on from the UN General Assembly last month, we've got the 9th informal meeting and the 16th joint consultative meetings between the African Union Peace and Security Council and the UNSC. So that's a lot, as always. Solomon, give us, if you will, your horizon scan or your readout of some of the key things that we need to watch out for this month.
Yes, indeed. I think as chair of the PSC Morocco, Morocco's program of work had a combination of some standing agenda items of the Peace and Security Council, particularly, for example, the session on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is part and parcel of the annual program of work of the PSC for the month of October, because that is the month when 1325 was adopted, and it's therefore the first session of the month on the 3rd of October, with a focus on protection of women and girls from sexual violence in conflict situations. I think this focus is well deserved on so many fronts. One, from the perspective of the fact that in the course of the past few years, well into 2022, we have seen increase in the number of conflicts on the continent, including in terms of their geographic spread. And therefore, with that comes the fact that women and girls, on account of their existing vulnerability in society, become much more exposed for the negative consequences and impacts of conflict.
Absolutely.
Including being targets, deliberate targets of violence, as we have seen in some of the conflict settings recently. They at times become the terrain on which conflicts are waged, and their bodies and the use of rape as a weapon of war, sexual violence as a weapon of war. These are all things that we have come to witness. And indeed, the UN, for example, if we make reference to the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence, issued a report in 2021, which clearly indicated a very worrying trend as far as the increase in the number of attacks against women and girls in conflict situations. And some of the countries in the world where most of the incidents of violence, sexual violence against women and girls happen are on the African continent.
Yeah.
Hence the importance of this particular session focusing on 1325. And of course, the question is, how for the PSC, how to take this forward and how to ensure that, the issue of sexual violence against women and girls is addressed, both as a thematic issue, and therefore what kind of monitoring and reporting and investigation processes need to be put in place, but also in terms of the PSC dealing with also individual country or conflict situations. So how does it factor in this issue in its engagement, broadly speaking, as part of its peacemaking, mediation, as well as conflict resolution efforts?
Yeah. Another standing issue or a standing agenda item, which is kind of connected in a way, the suffering of women and girls, rightly front and centre, but also this agenda item around the recruitment of child soldiers in conflict situations.
Yes.
How does that agenda item come to be, and what will be discussed there?
So that one is also indeed one of the standing agenda items of the Peace and Security Council. This is about children affected by armed conflict. That is how it is framed.
Right.
Within that, this particular session focuses on the recruitment and youth of children in conflict situations.
Gotcha.
So the issue of violence against children in armed conflict, takes different forms, as you know. And one of the leading, perhaps major, international crime is the recruitment and youth of children in armed conflict. And this is also something that happens in a number of conflict settings, which have been reported with various statistics, right? So the attention that is given for this also helps in terms of, for example, if this is the largest incident of crime against children that happens in conflict settings on the continent, it gives rise to questions about what kind of interventions do you need then to devise in order particularly to give particular attention to this particular form of violations against children in armed conflict.
Again, there's some nice connections here. The third substantive session for the month is a ministerial level discussion on development and de-radicalisation. When you're talking about interventions, development strategies, de-radicalisation strategies as levers to counter terrorism and violent extremism. Flesh that session out a little bit for us.
So this one is an agenda item of the PSC for the month proposed by Morocco itself.
Okay.
So this is, at the initiative of Morocco. And it builds on the last months that Morocco chaired the PSC. This was in September 2019. And when Morocco last chaired the PSC in September 2019, the focus, one of its signature PSC engagement was the ministerial meeting on the nexus between peace and security and development.
Okay.
It was a broader focus.
Right.
This time around, the focus is narrowed to a specific issue of peace and security that is basically counterterrorism and violent extremism. All right. So it builds on that question of nexus between peace and security and development, and then narrows it down to this one. And of course, here, I think what I like about this one is basically that it makes the question of the socioeconomic dimension of the factors that actually lead to or create the conditions for the emergence and expansion of terrorism front and center.
Yeah.
Okay. Usually the discussion about terrorism tends to focus on, for example, how to strengthen military operations against terrorism, how to strengthen law enforcement, how to strengthen intelligence sharing, how to, reinforce border control. So heavy security oriented approach. Now this, kind of shifts attention, and rightly so, to the socioeconomic livelihoods deficiencies that actually create the vacuum, giving rise to the emergence and expansion of terrorism. So it is indeed one of the signature events for Morocco for this month. Hopefully it would push the Peace and Security Council to, if you like, upscale the extent to which attention is given and policy interventions are crafted around addressing the socioeconomic and governance deficits that give rise to this challenge.
That sounds like a very kind of thoughtful approach and in line with some of those ideas you've been fleshing out for us earlier on.
Exactly.
So we'll watch that with great interest.
Yep.
Then moving on, let's look at these couple of meetings between the AU Peace and Security Council and the UNSC.
Annual consultative meeting.
Interesting, flowing directly on from UNGA last month. So interested to hear. I know they sort of switch from Addis to New York and back again every alternate year. Tell us a bit more about what they will likely discuss. I mean, we've touched on some of these UNSC reform issues, Voice for Africa, or is that going to be discussed, or are we more sticking on specific kind of issues, unconstitutional changes of government, terrorism in the Sahel?
So, I mean,
how do you see it?
It has been, for the past couple of months, preparations have been underway with exchanges between the Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council on determining the agenda for the 16th annual consultative meeting of the PSC and the UN Security Council, and the 9th informal seminar, which has become, part and parcel of the annual engagement between the two councils. And they have finally agreed on the agenda items. So they start usually with the informal seminar, where mostly thematic issues are discussed. One of the issues that has been on the agenda in the consultations for a number of years, for example, has to do with working methods issues in the relationship between the UNSC and the PSC. This is going to be one of the areas that would be discussed, strengthening cooperation under the agenda, strengthening cooperation between the UNSC and the PSC. That issues relating to, for example, pending issues like, for example, undertaking joint field missions.
Yes.
They agreed that, they are committed to undertake joint field missions, for example, similar to the joint field mission that the PSC and the European Committee on Peace and Security undertake. All right. But on the modalities of how to go about implementing or undertaking joint field missions, there has been disagreement between the PSC and the UNSC. Let's see if any progress would come out this time around. The other item for the informal seminar has to do with strengthening AU and UN peace support operations in Africa. This, among other things, for example, would touch on the perennial issue of sustainable and predictable funding of AU peace support operations.
Sure.
And of course, the issue of how and when to resume the discussions about accessing contributions of the UN.
Yes.
All right, for supporting African Union peace support operations, which is linked to one of the issues that we have discussed earlier on, which is the operationalization of the Peace Fund.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So that is the second item. The third item and final item for the 9th informal seminar is promotion of peace building for sustaining peace in Africa. Of course, this idea. It interfaces with the role of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, but also with that of the from the African Union side, the post-conflict reconstruction and development policy, as well as the center that has become operational in Cairo. Then, the actual consultative meeting happens the following day.
Yeah.
And usually the focus is on conflict situations.
Right.
All right. Here we also have three focusing on regional issues. For example, the situation in West Africa and the Sahel, including countering the threat of terrorism. Not surprisingly, as we indicated earlier, a top agenda item for peace and security on the continent is the first one. The second one is the situation in the Great Lakes region, with a focus on Eastern DRC and the Central African Republic. And then, interestingly, although it is a thematic issue, but it has become part of the consultative meeting, it's about sanctions in conflict situations in Africa.
Indeed.
Yeah. Because there have been one of the interesting issues that a number of African presidents in their speech during the General Assembly debate have raised have to do with the use of sanctions in conflict situations. For some of the cases such as Zimbabwe, Central African Republic, some of the leaders calling for the lifting of these sanctions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. A really divisive issue that has been so for, a long time. Busy couple of days on during those couple of meetings.
Back in New York.
Okay. Moving on to the fourth substantive session. Again, a timely topic ahead of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. Building resilience and focusing on the issue of food security for African island states in particular, but I guess also an opportunity to take stock of the African position and African preparations for the big meeting in Egypt.
Yeah.
What do you expect to come out of that?
I think this is two things that I would like to say on this one. The first thing is this theme, focusing on island states in Africa, is a follow-up to the commitment made during the COP22 that was held in Marrakesh in 2016. So Morocco as host and indeed as champion of the COP22, and this theme of the COP22 is actually bringing in, ahead of the COP27, an agenda that was already part and parcel of previous COP22.
Okay.
That is one.
Yeah.
The second aspect is focusing on food security is also interesting, particularly if you look at from the vantage point of what is unfolding in Madagascar. Madagascar situation where famine is declared, and that is said to be the first famine induced by climate change.
Right.
All right. So looking at it from that perspective as well, this focus on food security in African island states with a focus towards COP27 is a very interesting one. Of course, it fits into also the broader food security discussion that was unfolding, including in the PSC. If you remember, in May, the PSC for the first time had actually a focus on food security under the AU theme of the year for 2022, with a focus, of course, on the role of conflict. And this time around, I think it fits the expectation is that how to take forward that specific agenda item within the context of COP27.
And a couple of small well, not small at all, actually, but a couple of interesting sort of AU organisational matters. This idea, further discussion around the establishment of a climate change fund and the likely elevation of the climate change unit at the AU into a fully fledged division. Certainly an interesting way to draw attention to the issue and to make the point, if it needed to be made, that the AU is taking this seriously.
But I mean, certainly at the level of the African Union, in terms of elevating its engagement on the climate change emergency, which is becoming more and more grave by the day, including by what we are witnessing, whether it is in terms of the expanding drought and threat of famine in the Horn of Africa, the flooding that we have witnessed in a number of countries on the continent, including Sudan most recently, as well as the incidents of cyclones on the eastern and southern Africa coast, the drought in the southern Africa region. All of this show that there is a need for elevating this. Of course, within that, the issue of, expanding or, upscaling the status of the institutions dealing with it within the African Union. And the question of funding, of course, the whole financing of adaptation is extremely important.
Huge question.
And in the current, of course, COP27, very, very pressing issue had also to do with loss and damage, which many African countries are actually suffering to the tune of some countries double-digit of their GDPs. And it clearly is indicative that there is a need for urgency, but also for the international community actually to walk the talk as far as the financing modalities for dealing with the threat of climate change is concerned.
I feel like in our November edition, we're going to have to find a way to carve out some time to talk about these climate change equity issues in a little bit more detail. In the few moments we have remaining, we really should take a quick look at the substantive session on the Sahel and looking at these countries that are intensely under the microscope: Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, again coming on the heels of the ECOWAS summit. Tell us a little bit about this session, and very briefly interested in any sort of steps forward in terms of deployment of troops and the mandate renewal of the G5 Sahel Joint Force.
Sure. So the Sahel obviously is a region of interest for Morocco as well, as a country neighboring the countries of the Sahel. And it also connects with the 23rd September ministerial meeting that was held on terrorism. The Sahel being the epicenter, not just in Africa, but also in the world, of the scourge of terrorism at the moment globally. So the focus on the Sahel would obviously address a number of issues relating to not just terrorism, but also some of the political challenges facing Sahelian countries, including, for example, the effective operationalization and functioning of the G5 Sahel, which experienced divisions as a result of the events in Mali, particularly as a result of the events in Mali. It was disallowed to be chairing the rotational chairing of the G5 Sahel, and then Mali decided to withdraw from the G5 Sahel. Mali, as a country of significance for the success of the G5 Sahel joint force, its withdrawal obviously is a major setback for the effective functioning of the G5 Sahel itself. And this obviously, I think, raises the importance of the discussion around the second point that you raised, which is the potential and the long discussed deployment of the 3,000 African Union troops to the Sahel in support of the operations of the G5 Sahel. I'm not sure how far we have come in terms of really the context. Definitely, this context has obviously increased the need for and the importance of that. But in terms of the operational issues of where the troops are going to come from, where the finance is going to come from, and how the 3,000 troops are going to relate to the G5 force are still questions for which I'm afraid that we are not yet fully, we have not yet fully clear answers.
Yeah. Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I want to spend maybe 1 minute looking at the Central African Republic and the AU Military Observer Mission there. The mandate is ending at the end of October, and I guess its continued existence and functioning depends on some agreement being found fairly shortly around funding arrangements, particularly in the context of EU funding. Do we expect an outcome on that issue? Noting you don't have a crystal ball necessarily.
I'm not really sure how much progress we have made from the last time the PSC held a session dedicated specifically to this question of the AU military observer mission in the CAR. This was the 193rd session that was held actually in July 2022. I think the convening of this session has to do with the fact that the mandate of the mission comes to an end at the end of October.
Yeah.
All right. So my sense is that if the issues that has made the full operationalization of this mission have not been addressed, not just in terms of the funding, but also the actual operation of the mission, then there is a risk that the PSC may decide that it may not proceed. Remember, there was another mission, a post-conflict reconstruction and development mission in the Gambia, which also came to an end before the full completion of its mandate. Indeed. And despite the continued interest of the Gambia for its continued operation in the Gambia.
Okay. Well, we're pretty much out of time, Solomon. So it sounds like another busy month for Morocco and all the members of the Peace and Security Council. We wish them fruitful deliberations, and we'll watch with great interest the results of the various sessions. Before we go, I want to spend maybe 30 seconds talking about the somewhat controversial decision or announcement by the current head of the junta in Chad to stand in the forthcoming presidential elections in contravention of the agreement and the understanding of the Peace and Security Council. What do you make of it?
So two things that, not necessarily linked, but interesting developments that we have witnessed over the course of the past couple of weeks. One is the second coup in Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
And obviously this raises questions about the threat of fragmentation that the military in Burkina Faso faces and the need for addressing this threat.
Yeah.
Without addressing this threat, it would be difficult both to ensure that there is a focus on a successful transition, but also in dealing with the expanding threat of terrorism in Burkina Faso.
Yeah, I'm pleased you went back to address that.
Yeah. Exactly. And there is a need for a robust and sustained engagement from both the African Union and also from ECOWAS. I think that sustained engagement may require the designation of a special envoy or a joint mechanism between the African Union and ECOWAS that would be on the ground in Ouagadougou, holding, if you like, the hands of the new junta and other stakeholders in order to identify a limited set of priorities on which they would have a focused engagement in order to avoid further fragmentation of the military, but also to roll out the transition within the timeline set.
Okay.
And on Chad, final point.
Junta.
Exactly. And that one, I think, the decision of the PSC not to suspend Chad dented the credibility of the PSC, because whenever there is a seizure of power by the army, the text of the African Union norm, particularly Article 7.1g, is very clear that you actually apply suspension, under the Constitutive Act of the African Union. That didn't happen, and it gave rise to charges of selectivity and double standard on the part of the PSC in applying this norm. But one of the things that the PSC did right at the time was to make a decision that the people responsible for seizing power in Chad from the side of the military would not be able to run for election when elections are held for restoring constitutional order in Chad. Now, the National Dialogue actually took a decision for the head of the military junta to be able to run for election.
Yeah.
It is really something that would definitely put the PSC on the spot, and it would be interesting to see how the PSC would be engaging this challenging issue.
Indeed, and we'll track it as always with great interest. To our listeners, we hope this podcast will once again provide a somewhat accessible way to understand the Peace and Security Council and its work. It's a work in progress, but we hope you like it so far. Next month, Namibia takes the Peace and Security Council chair, so we will join you then. But before we go, we'd like to wish the following African nation states a happy National Day. We had Nigeria for the 1st of October, Guinea for the 2nd of October, Lesotho for the 4th of October, Uganda for the 9th of October, Equatorial Guinea for the 12th, and Zambia for the 24th of October. We wish you all peace and prosperity.
I would like also to thank our listeners for joining us once again for conversing on Africa's peace. We look forward to have you once again next time. Thank you very much.